Hello and welcome to Gaming the Podcast. My name is John Robertson, joined as ever by Stace Harmon. And on this episode, we are talking about Acid Nerve's Death's Door. Now, this is the second game from two-person team Acid Nerve, their first being Titan Souls, which was released a number of years ago now. So Stace and I have both been playing Death's Door. I think it's safe to say, spoiler, that we both like it. But Stace, what was your, and having completed it recently, what was your what's your kind of initial sort of instant reaction once the credit rolled? Were there things that sort of stuck out as being particularly good, particularly bad? What were your emotions like after those credits popped up?
I think at the point that the credits roll, there was a sense of relief directly tied to the final boss fight because it's tough. It is a tough final boss fight. It's a very fitting, I think, final boss fight for the rest of the game. I'm not going to spoil too much. Some stuff might be slightly unavoidable. I'm not going to talk about story spoilers or anything like that. So you might consider the fact that there's a boss fight at the end of the game to be a spoiler, for example. But there we are. There is. And it's a multi-stage boss fight. It's a very tricky boss fight. And it was a boss fight that caused me some frustration, but mostly in that way that some of the best games do. I'm thinking of the Dark Souls and some of the trickier Zelda bosses, I suppose, as well, would fall into that category, where it's never unfair. It's about kind of pattern recognition. It's about learning the moves. It's about, you have all the tools that you need in order to overcome this thing. And so it becomes about the fact that if you die or if you mess it up, then it's because of your own actions. That's how I felt. It was very much, I knew I needed to beat this thing, and it was that thing of the more you die, the more determined you are to beat it. So it's the right side of frustrating. It's frustrating just because you get really close and then you die, and there's the bosses as a point of design. The bosses don't have health bars. They have like these visual effects that tell you how close they are to dying. All of the enemies do, but you see it most noticeably on the boss fights because they take the longest. And so you know that you're close. You just don't know quite how close. And so it's even that as a tiny thing, it's an incredible piece of visual design, and the way that it makes me act in the game is very interesting because there's like a risk reward thing, because I can't see exactly how much health the boss has got because there's no actual health bar. You get towards the end and you keep thinking that the next couple of hits, it's going to be it. It's the next if I can just get those last couple of hits in, which then can push you, if you know that you're almost dead yourself, can push you into making a mistake, or it can push you to take that extra swipe of the sword or swing of the hammer that can ultimately go either way. It can be like, yes, that's the killing blow, or it can mean that you leave yourself open for a counterattack, or you mistime it, and so you put yourself in harm's way. So suffice to say, it's very well designed. It's one of those that it can be frustrating in the boss fights, but only in that way that kind of Dark Souls is. That I always feel with Dark Souls that it's like, it's probably my fault. There's not a lot of unfair stuff that happens, is what I'm saying. There's not a lot of like, oh, you should have seen, there's without foreknowledge, there's no way that you could have avoided X. That doesn't happen. It's like the attacks are telegraphed in even in a way that you need to learn, but in a way that is recognizable. You don't just get like, out of nowhere slammed against the wall and there's nothing you could have done to avoid it. So relief then was the first kind of thing that I felt after I beat the boss, because it took me a long time.
That's what every games designer, games developer looks for in their player base. The primary response to beating a game is just relief. That it's done now.
Well, it was, relief in that, not relief, oh, thank God that's over, I'm never playing that again. Absolutely not. Relief in that, very specific boss fight. And then there's also like the thing with there's a critical path through the game, obviously, and that takes in a number of boss fights, but there's a load of extra sort of side stuff that you can do. And so having beaten the game, or completed the game, if that's how we want to term it, the language I think is interesting there, but having beaten the game, as we often talk about doing with games, the thing I'm also interested in and looking forward to going back into it and exploring it, kind of just all the nooks and crannies and all the bits and pieces, to explore the world, because I enjoyed spending a lot of time in the world, and it was like the boss fights and stuff that you need to do to progress the story, but the actual joy of the game comes from exploring and finding how this area links to this area. And there's a little bit of kind of sort of the Metroid about it, of you get a certain weapon or a tool and you can go back and find other paths, but they're not critical path things, they are optional things. So it rewards exploration it's not like, oh, this is artificially gated off until you go to this other area and pick up this thing, and you're going to need to crisscross in order to finish the story. They're quite discrete areas, and you go into one and you can play that through to the end, and then you go back to kind of the hub and you can go into the next one. But if you want to, you can go back and explore and have a look for other things. And often they are power-up related things, but there's also little bits of narrative reward as well dotted throughout, and world building and kind of the environmental storytelling that we've talked about before is also dotted throughout and is used as reward as well. So I enjoyed it a lot. I enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to playing more of it. It's telling that I only unlocked 5 achievements having completed the game. Played it for 12 hours and unlocked 5 achievements. So there's a lot more to see.
Yeah. I think a lot of, I sort of reflect in a similar way to a lot of that. I think one of the things that I like about it, the game's quite minimal. It's not as minimal as Titan Souls, but it's quite minimal. And I think a lot of those things you've spoken about kind of play into that minimalist nature of it. Even in the sense of the bosses, like the bosses are kind of quite minimal in the sense that, they only have a few attacks that they'll repeat over and over again, and those attacks might evolve in some way, like they might become more frequent, or they might be launched at you more quickly, or they might be linked into one another in a more complex way as the boss sort of starts to panic and throw everything at you as it's about to die. But also in the exploration as well, it's quite minimal in the sense that yes, there is extra exploration to do, but it never feels like it doesn't feel like it's just there simply to just well, we've got to give them something else to do, so now we better just dump this extra thing in here. Like, it always feels like it's valuable to do, and it tends to end on something that is genuinely worthwhile as well, whether it's like a secret boss fight or it's like a piece of vitality for your to upgrade your health, or to see a bit of the world that just looks cool or is surprising. I think also the minimal nature of it introduces, there's more, when I thought back on it, there's more elements than I kind of maybe necessarily than you're kind of actively aware of when you're playing the game, but each of those elements kind of come and go fairly quickly, and like their little 2-hour, like the game is sort of spread, the bulk of the game is the 3 bosses that you need to kill and their specific area that they have, and within each of that area, which is almost like almost like mini countries within this like cohesive world that they sort of like rule over, and in there there'll be little elements that they come and go very quickly. So like sliding around on the ice like comes and goes very quickly. Laser puzzles come and go very quickly, like the moving platforms and firing up the furnaces in the witch's place come and go very quickly. So it more like, as I say, like looking back on it and reflecting on it, there's more sort of unique, separate things that you're moving on to all the time. And I think, like, in one sense that's minimal, in like it's not like they don't do it saying, oh no, here's the ice puzzle, and or not, you know, here's the ice sort of like assault course, like test of your skills, and now we're going to put the ice puzzle on top of the laser puzzle on top of the floating platforms puzzle. It's like, no, let's just do the ice bit, and now we'll move on to the next bit, and we'll move on to the next bit. So the game constantly feels like, on the one side, yes, those bits are challenging, but it constantly wants you to move on and experience the next thing and experience the next idea, rather than just saying, and now we're just going to double down on this bit and make sure that you're the most skilled player in the world at doing this before you're allowed to move on. Like that element of it is saved for the bosses. Whereas the actual exploration and the kind of puzzle elements throughout the worlds, whilst there are different degrees of the ice, some ice bits are harder than others and some laser bits are harder than others, it's, you know, like in Titan Souls, like it was all about like focusing on a single mechanic, like the shooting of the arrow and moving, and just really nailing that to, you know, the nth degree. Whereas on this, the evolution seems to be actually, we're now just going to give the player more things to do, but still not clutter those individual things. Like in Titan Souls, it wasn't cluttered because it was so sort of pure, that mechanic. Here they've kind of kept with those purity of mechanics, but just sort of place lots of them next to each other as you go along. But I think what the skill is that, like, even though you're doing these things, because you're doing them within the separate worlds, like I said, each like sort of location feels like a cohesive whole. It doesn't feel just like this mismatch and just sort of crazy things just on top of each other.
Yeah, I think the fact that you do go through them, that once you've started one, you do see it through to the end, I think helps that you're not, it isn't artificially gated off to say, okay, well, you can go this far in this area, but to get any further, you then have to unlock the hook shot, and so you have to go somewhere else and get there. It's like once you're in it until the point that you've finished it. Yeah. And
it's quite comforting in that way. Yeah, it's not like Hollow Knight or Metroidvania where it's like, oh, now I've got to backtrack through 6 hours of level or whatever.
It feels like it gives each area room to breathe. And there's like this sort of nice, it's quite peaceful. It's quite a quiet, kind of calm game. Not in that you aren't interacting with enemies or solving puzzles, or just, you know, it's not like not calm in the way that you might, I don't know, perhaps talk about a walking simulator or something, but calm in that kind of comfort way that you're talking about. That you, once you get into something, it's kind of, you're going to be there for a while, and you kind of get to exercise those muscles, and the puzzle solving does build upon itself within each area, without layering, like, oh, there's that laser thing that you had to do in that other area, now we're going to chuck it in here. Like it feels like each place is its own discrete, I kind of like, I guess, like Zelda dungeons, but this has more, it kind of takes up more geography in the world. Like there's an actual, like, it's like a domain, I suppose. It's like, here's an area that this boss or this person has kind of made for themselves. You can see, like, there's an Urn Witch and she has a mansion, and that mansion is in some grounds, and the grounds are in a wider sort of geographical region that has its own features. So yeah, it feels like it's just happy to let you explore and to not, it doesn't need to give you new things to to look at or to challenge you with every 5 seconds, because it's just like, you can see how this area unfolds and how it plays out. And that extends into things like problem solving and the puzzles, that you don't have to, the game doesn't really intrude at any point. It just lets you get on with it, and it trusts that you work it out. And invariably you do work it out. And it does that thing of, you know, it then means that you can feel clever when even if you find the answer by accident. There's a particular room in one of the areas that looks like a dead end, and then I accidentally smashed a pot that I couldn't even see, and then I noticed that in the reflection in the floor.
Oh,
Was like, and that was that.
That's in the witch's place.
Yeah, and there's in other games that would have been. There would have been a pop-up. There would have been some character there on hand to say, "Oh, it's odd. Have you noticed how you can see things in the reflection that you can't see in the real world?" It would have been just like,
or if it was Resident Evil, it would have been glowing, or like doing that tingy lights, beam of light thing that Resident Evil, not beam of light, that like flashing thing that it does.
And that's just like quite a confident kind of, let's just trust that if you are exploring in the way that the game is set up for you to do, you're going to come across these things and you're going to solve it. And even if you don't, it kind of just sits there for you to come back to at some point if you want to. Like, as far as I can tell, I don't think there's any areas that once you've left them, you can't get back to them. Just trying to think if I don't think there's any. So. I think you can always, you can always get back places. So, and that also is quite a sort of comforting thing, because it means you're not worrying about needing to get every single tiny thing on the first run through. Whereas in something like Resident Evil, for example, Resident Evil 8, Resident Evil Village, you do need to do that. Once you go into a particular, there's certain things, if you miss them on the first way through as you're trying to escape something, then that's too bad. You're not going to get that particular collectible or that that particular item. So there's like a nice, it just feels like it's got a very nice kind of, it's very nicely paced, it's very confident in its delivery, and it just lets you kind of just get on with it and it doesn't feel the need to ram things down your throat. On
the exploration side, I think the only time actually that I thought the pacing wasn't it's not necessarily I suppose it is the pacing. The pacing wasn't necessarily calming, was when you need to like go back to an area, or you've forgotten where you've been, or where you need to go and you can visualize the room but you don't know how to get there. That sort of, and then it just became a bit of like trial and error. It's like, hey, walk into here. Is this the right place? No, it's not. Do I walk back into here? Is this the right place? No, it's not. That's the only time I think I got like frustrated with the exploration elements, that it was because some of the areas like the Urn Witch's place, well, all three of the main places are quite maze-like. So it's not, I didn't find it always, I wasn't memorizing the layout of the areas very quickly. So then when I knew I need to get back to a certain place, it was just try and error. Is it that way? Is it that way? Is it that way? Is it that way? It's not. And one of the things I noticed in reviews as well, a number of reviews that are sort of commented similarly and said that a map would be helpful, or some way to just like mark where you'd been. Because there are areas where you go to and you can't access, like Metroidvania style, you can't access them immediately. Like the hookshot area in the castle, there's a bit that you get to and you can't cross the gap until you've got the hookshot. And then once I got the hookshot, I was like, okay, I need to go back there. I couldn't remember, like for the life of me, where that was. Yeah. And it took like 15 minutes to find it or something.
Oh. Yeah, see that's the map thing specifically is interesting, because that's one of the things that I noted that I liked, that there wasn't a map, that there is I think that for me, that grounded me more in the world, because I was more aware of, or more present, I suppose, in the world than looking at a map screen. And this is, for somebody that plays still plays a lot of Hitman, where a lot of that game, once you've memorized the layouts, that's fine. But a lot of that game is not otherwise played on the map screen, of planning where are the staircases, how do I plan a route around this place, which is fine. Like that's a thing for that game. It's part of the strategic element of that game. But I liked that I wasn't sort of dipping in and out of a menu screen, and perhaps that's for me, that was part of the pacing. Perhaps that was part of that sort of calming and quiet pacing, was the fact that you don't spend a lot of time in menu screens at all.
Yeah, I think one way maybe it wouldn't necessarily need to be up. It's just some sort of navigation tool. Like I was thinking maybe it could be, how you like pot seeds in plants for health. It could be like, I know you just like, it's almost like a breadcrumb trail or something, like not a literal one, like here you go, but like by like certain doorways or something, maybe you could just like put like, you know, a flower next to it or something, and then that just notes that like, okay, I need to go back there next time, because you're right, yeah, you don't want to be going in and out of menu screens all the time, and I don't think you necessarily want a mini map either. Certainly not like a Resident Evil sort of, or like a pop-up map where it's like, no, the room is green or whatever when you've completed it, but some sort of ability to mark it, because you can't really do it. I was actually like, because if you destroy stuff, it reappears, so you can't destroy stuff to use it as a marker in the world. I have like crates or vases or whatever, but I mean, it's not a huge problem.
Yeah,
but on the pacing side, going through the same room 5 times.
I think for me, the reason there's probably 2 things. I played it in quite a short time span. So I played it over the course of a week. No, not even actually. Probably the first time I played it probably was, a week before I finished it. But I then played the meat of the game. I played probably over sort of 3 or 4 days. And so there is something in that, and I wasn't really playing anything else whilst I was playing that. So it was a constant I felt very kind of attached to the world, and not, that doesn't mean that I remembered where everything was, but it meant that I guess I had a sort of a base memory enough to think, oh yeah, I will come back here when I've got the hook shot. And then the next real world day, I got the hook shot. I was like, oh, okay, I need to go back to that place. So the way that it's played, that obviously is going to make a difference. If you play what for me was 12 hours to see the credits, if you play that over, a couple of weeks, or you start playing it and then you play something else or several other things and go back to it, then definitely I can see how that would definitely, it would be like, well, where am I and what am I doing? And I think the other thing for me was that the world it's big enough for exploration and to promote a feeling of place, but it's not so big that I had no idea. And I think that probably feeds back into this idea of there being kind of discrete areas that I knew that, oh yeah, I remember now that in the Ernwitch's mansion, there is a hook shot somewhere. There's a hook shot location. There's a hook shot sort of puzzle or something, an area that I can get to with the hook shot somewhere there. And it wasn't big enough for me to then be kind of completely lost and give up, because I just couldn't be bothered. So yeah, I know what you mean. Some way to maybe mark the walls or put something somewhere which you would, as an explorer, you would have some sort of way of marking your passage through this world, wouldn't you? But I think it's the fact also that I think almost all of that, if not all of that kind of crisscrossing and backtracking is done optionally, I think helps that as well. I think that stops it from being frustrating, because you don't spend 3 hours in one location, go somewhere else and get something, and then have to remember how to get back in order to progress the story. You go through these areas kind of in one go, but you can go back and explore more and find more areas and find power-ups and stuff if you want to. So yeah, I think it's I understand the desire for that. I think if you're playing it through in quite a short space of time, you're probably going to avoid the frustration that can bring. So yeah, but the lack of which feeds in, I think, as well to the general lack of just flab, the lack of everything feels quite deliberate, and everything is very, as you were sort of saying, but minimalist is perhaps not the right word that I'm looking for, but it's very deliberate, and it's very streamlined. It feels like everything matters. It feels like, if you do this navigation puzzle on the ice with the hook shot, and you get to a point where you achieve a thing, you get a power up, whatever it is you might get, and then it feeds back round to the beginning, and it's done. It's like its own little self-contained thing that you go in for to do a particular thing, you see it through to the end, and then you move on. And there isn't like a bunch of offshoots off that then mean you need to keep coming back to the same area and over again in order to explore more and more. You can do it, within a couple of visits, I think. So, yeah, I think it's generally. I mean, by comparison, I played not that long ago. I played Link's Awakening on the Switch, and Death's Door for me is it kind of out Zelda's that Zelda game. I preferred Death's Door to Link's Awakening. And some of that is because of that feeling for me in Link's Awakening of kind of, it's a bit more bloated. It's a bit more toing and froing and needing to repeatedly go back to certain places. And I had that with that I went back to that game after playing it for a while and couldn't really remember what I was doing or where I was going. And that does have a map, and that was a bit frustrating. So yeah, I think Death's Door is a very, very concisely designed game, which probably isn't surprising given that it's from the guys that did Titan Souls. I mean, that was a very concise, very minimalist, had a very specific purpose. And this, I feel like you can see the lineage in this game from Titan Souls. It's a very iterative, in a way that I think we've talked before about, like Arcane do that. They build on stuff they've done before. Not in let's just reuse it because, it worked once, so why not work again? It's like there's an actual purpose to reuse it. There's an iterative sort of evolution to it as well. It's not just, this is that thing that you saw in this other game.
Yeah. Well, I think on the iterative side, like Titan Souls was basically all combat, it's basically all boss fights. There's some exploration, but really it's just in service of getting to the next boss fight rather than exploration, like sort of navigation exploration being a thing unto itself. And we've spoken about exploration and pacing in this primarily, but Death's Door is also incredibly combat heavy. There's combat constantly, whether it's boss fights or just going through areas where different enemies are hanging around. I like the fact as well that the enemies are unique to each area. Like a lot of them are kind of the same in that they, like, each area will have similar enemy actions for sort of assigned to each enemy will be very similar to each, but they'll be given like their own little flavor in each area, even if that's just like a visual, like the pot that they're wearing on their head or whatever is different just to match the area. But combat in this game is more, well, I don't know if it's more complex. Well, no, I suppose it is more complex in terms of the interactions that you've got available to you and what the game can throw at you, because it throws multiple enemies at you at different times, whereas Titan Souls were, single boss fights that you had to focus on and beat each time. But the combat in this, there's a sort of there's a sharpness to combat that isn't a sharpness in the same way as like 1-to-1 frame rate like Street Fighter or something like that. It is closer to something like Dark Souls, where you press a button and it's a second, or it's not a second, but it's some small amount of time, some number of frames before your attacks actually do damage. So you've got to you've got to kind of preload everything. Yeah. And everything sort of takes more damage than you kind of expect it to, or does for me anyway. I always expect it. It's almost like you've got to do that one last thing in order, or that one last dodge in order to put the thing away for good.
You like some of your attacks are in chains of 3, and an enemy might take 4 hits. So you do your 3 chain attack, and then there's a slight pause. And if you're not ready immediately, then you're probably going to get hit. If you're not ready to roll out the way or to hit again. Yeah, and that's, I mean, you can upgrade your weapons and they become more powerful, but yes, I very much doubt that's not deliberate, that it's done that way, that and gives you something to think about and react to in that moment.
Yeah, I was surprised as well. I was surprised / it's not that I was disappointed, but I didn't love the avarice sections where it just throws loads of enemies at you and you've got to light the 4 burning torches. But then actually I came to really like those. Like after the first one, I was like, oh no, once I died on the first one of those a number of times, I was like, oh, I don't know if I like this. But then once I'd done that one, I then came to look forward to the ones that came up beyond that. because it does. They feel very. They ask different things of you than the boss fights do. Like, you're constantly having to stay on your toes. You're avoiding more stuff. There's often, you're just being attacked from more directions and more areas. You don't always know what's coming. Sometimes there's like cool versions of enemies in there that are like, a little bit tougher than the normal ones that you see just running around. And I came to really appreciate those, and like the level of the perfectly pitched, I think, like level of difficulty assigned to those. Like, they're hard, but they're not too hard. And I don't think the game is wildly difficult. Like, I don't think it's nowhere near as difficult as Titan Souls, for example. That's way harder. No. This is a much more inviting game. And because it's more inviting on that difficulty level, it's sort of, whereas in Titan Souls, like, it always felt like, and now this is the thing you got to do to beat this boss. And if you can't do that thing, then, well, you can't play the game. Yeah. Whereas in this, it's much more rounded. It's much more open to experimentation. It's much more open to deciding, I like this weapon, or I don't like that weapon. It's not, well, you don't use that weapon, therefore you're really going to find this boss hard, because that's really what you should be doing. Like, it's not like that. And I think that's not easy to do, certainly in a game that's only designed by a small number of people. That's not easy to do, to provide a player with that level of that many options in how you go about attacking the game, and still, no matter what weapon you choose, no matter what you've upgraded, no matter how you approach it, that level of difficulty still remains pretty similar, no matter what you're doing. And like, it's not that I went, obviously I haven't gone into every boss fight and selected every weapon to test that out, but just as you're moving through the game and you're switching things up and you're adapting your playstyle, you're changing weapons or whatever, like, it's always has that consistent, it's hard, it's challenging, but it's never sort of too easy. You're not like breezing by, although I'm sure some superstar players are doing that.
No hit runs and all that nonsense.
Start again if you get hit. And but then you're also not, it's not so challenging that you feel just completely flummoxed and out of your depth and not knowing how to even begin to think about how to progress. And there was definitely some boss fights where I switched weapon halfway through, not because, so there aren't any like what I would term Mega Man style boss fights where, this weapon, you have to use this weapon to beat this boss, or this weapon is quite obviously intended to counter this boss's attacks or here's the bow and arrow.
There's none of that. There's none of that. And in the same way that there isn't in Dark Souls is designed in such a way that it respects or accommodates or whatever your choices, and your choices are based on your own preferences of play, not on what the game is forcing you to do. So if you want to play the entire game of Dark Souls with a spear, you can do that. If you want to play it with a great axe, you can do that. The game doesn't like deliberately antagonize you for making those choices, and Death's Door does the same thing. So I was changing weapons partway through boss fights, not because it was obvious that, this weapon's going to be better against this boss, but just because my own, like, just the pace of the attacks, or the recognizing that there are windows of attack that suit the way that I play, which was to like fully upgrade my agility stat so that I was quicker at moving around and could roll more frequently. The cooldown on the roll was much shorter. And then using the daggers, which are a weak but fast. So it's kind of get in, couple of hits, get out. And that worked for the most part for me. But then I also found that actually arming the hammer and then just kind of wailing in, and the risk reward thing of, well, I'm going to be in this combat, I'm going to be up close and just executing more attacks more quickly, in the hope of finishing the fight, because the longer it goes on and the more these attack patterns come at me, the more likely I am to die. So I was constantly making a choice, and it wasn't, unlike Dark Souls, it wasn't I'm going to pick my weapon at the beginning and then basically use that for the entire game. It was very much like each one is valid. The only one I didn't really use was the umbrella, which I noticed there is an achievement for completing the game with only using the umbrella. So that's one of the 19 other achievements that I don't have yet.
I gravitated.
I like that. It kind of respects your choices. It accommodates your choices, and your choices are. It feels like it's player directed and driven rather than needing to respond to what the game's doing. It's like, well, I can do this. I can overcome this. I just need to think about what tools I have on offer and whether I want to change them up or whether I want to keep going with what I've got. Not because I have to. Not because this is the hammer boss. This is the dagger boss, etc. So yeah, and I really like that. I like that kind of. Yeah, it's like that cliched thing of play it your way, but it's like this does that in a very quiet, kind of unassuming sort of way.
Yeah, I gravitated towards the hammer, and I've used the hammer most of the time throughout the game, but I didn't play it in like a wailing on it way. I played it I got very good with the hammer at knowing the exact attack distance I can get away with without the enemy hitting me. So I was playing quite a high movement, like hammer build, I guess, to use like Dark Souls sort of like description. But so like get in there, kind do a hit with the hammer.
Blood build. It's like a
shotgun
baseball bat kind of shotgun
baseball bat, get in, get out. So like get in there with the hammer, do one hit, maybe two, if you can really, and if you upgrade the whichever one, I can't remember what one is it, dexterity? I can't remember, one of them that makes your sort of combos chain together more quickly. Yeah. Then sometimes you can get away with doing, and I'm thinking about the Betty boss fight, really. Like sometimes you can get away with doing 2 hits, but really you only want to do 1. And then just get in and get out and just make sure you've built enough distance again so that when it starts doing that rolling attack, you can easily get out of the way. So yeah, I like it. It was quite an interesting way to play with a weapon that would normally be just seen as like the slow lumbering, but just absolutely brutal per hit one. But combining that with like high movements. But I think the game in general that needs to be played with kind of high movement speeds, like because you've got so little health, and bosses have sometimes like the mobs of enemies as well, but certainly bosses have high. Well, I mean, certainly compared to you, enormous hit point pools. So, and you can't regain any health during boss fights. So you've really got to be moving, and you can't block. So you've really got to be moving, constantly. You can't just be standing.
Well, it becomes
there.
about learning that those frames of invincibility that you have when you roll, as is the same with Titan Souls, as is the same with Dark Souls. It's that thing of there's the tools. And we're not necessarily going to, nobody's going to pop up and tell you, oh, if you roll at just the right time, you can avoid any incoming damage. You just learn that. You just learn that that's the case. Just like you learn that smashing random pots or mushrooms early on replenishes your
Took me ages to figure
magic
that out.
meter. It's just a random. It doesn't tell you that. It's just a random thing.
And beating enemies does it as well. It took me ages to figure that out.
Any melee attack on an enemy,
at first I thought it was just like a time-based thing, and then I was just like standing around, like waiting for my bow to replenish or whatever, because I needed to shoot something at some point or whatever it was. I can't remember. And I think just by chance I was just smashing stuff, and I just saw the white little orbs refill. But yeah, it took me like 2 hours to figure that out.
It just you just and it, like everything else, you're just kind of exploring, and it just and you work it out yourself, and it feels good. You don't have a Navi style little follower who points these things out to you, and that's
Cortana just constantly telling you what's going on. I mean, we're pretty much out of time, but just one other thing I just wanted to point out. So what did you think of so we've spoken about this this lack of padding, this minimal, for want of a better term, kind of approach to the design of the game, exploration and combat. What about so I think in a similar way, the narrative it can kind of plays into that sort of that pacing. It's quite, it's reflective. It gives you time to do what you want and think what you want. And in a game that is about death, I think it's I like the fact that it could have easily been really grim, and everyone could be distraught, and it's like really morose and, you know, just not very pleasant. But I like the characters are quite funny. Like they're quite like funnily sort of like reflective on on the situation. I also think it's actually quite, even though it's all about death and that you're killing things, and these things should be dying. It's got a very positive outlook still, I think, because basically, like the way I read it is like, you know, the game is kind of saying that like it's not really focused on the death and the dying. It's focused on the fact that there's no new life coming into the world. So that means that there's no new, you know, emotions, there's no new idea, there's no new like characters, there's no new interpretations that have come, because these people that just don't die just increasingly become locked into these ideas that they have, and that's just the way things are now forever. So there's no even though it's a game about death kind of, but it's actually a game about the fact that you need death in order to have life, almost.
And it contextualizes life and achievement and ambition and all of that in the with the finite nature of life. And well, what do these things mean if you don't have an end point? And conversely, what do these things mean if you know the exact time you're going to die? Because that's the thing that happens, a narrative element that comes up later on. That's one of the questions that's posed. That knowing when you're going to die, what does that do to your life? Does that mean that everything revolves around that one moment and you're constantly counting down to that one moment? So there is a lot of, you know, on the nature of death and life and the cycle, and death being a natural part of life, not something, you know, well, depending on what you believe, there is a finality to it, but it's a finality to be embraced, and it also gives meaning to the other stuff that you do, because without it, you can become quite literally bloated in the narrative of Death's Door.
I wonder.
It's got stuff to say on like the notion of hereditary rule and inherited responsibility and burden and like, if you're just doing the best that you can, what does that mean? If you're presented with a certain set of choices and you make those choices, who is somebody else to say that those are good or bad, or like, because you've lived that and they haven't? There's a lot there, but delivered in a very kind of, again, sort of minimalist, quiet, reflective way, not rammed down your throat.
I wonder if that's why they made getting an extra piece of health so difficult, because it is to extend your life is quite literally unnatural and shouldn't be done, and kind of goes against it's what a lot of the characters in the game are fighting against anyway. So I wonder if that's like if they've tied that in deliberately, that like, yeah, okay, fine, we'll give you a way to extend your health, but I mean, you're going to have to go through a lot of exploration, because those health shrines are not obvious at all.
I finished the game, as I say, 12 hours. I found 3 health shrines, so I didn't even get to a point where I upgraded my health, and 2 of the magic shrines, or vice versa, I don't remember, but I only found 5, I think, of the available. I think there might be 15 or 16. I think it's whatever it is. I think you can basically get 2 or 3 extra pieces of life.
I think there's 8 of each.
Right, okay. So 16 in total. And I didn't, and that ties again into the design, because the game isn't designed in a way that it assumes that once you get to the final boss, you're going to have 20 health, you know? The most you can get is 6, and I did it with 4. And I'm not, you know, as we've talked about many times before, I'm not exactly a, you know, power player with when it comes to video games, but the game is designed without making the assumption that you have to be leveled up, or you're going to be leveled up by the time you get to that point. And that's just a nice clean, it's not artificially bloated for the sake of, well, we can make this super difficult because you're going to have almost infinite health by this point, so it doesn't matter, you know.
There's an interesting relationship there between,
and every attack does 1 bit of damage. Is also that's a point. Even the bosses, they hit you and they do 1 damage. That's, you know, a finite thing.
Yeah, there's an interesting relationship there, because normally games would not promote, but like reward players explicitly for going and finding all of the extra stuff and coming in and coming back to a boss fight with it. And this one does, of course it does. It gives you more health, gives you more magic. But it kind of, at the same time, it undermines the message of the game almost. So it's almost like the game feels like it is designed to be completed with 4 blocks of health. So then going and doing all of the extra stuff kind of almost undermines that core design that was the core idea of putting the players into situations with 4 health blocks was what everything was designed around, and then giving them the chance to go and do extra health kind of, it takes away, well, I don't know, that's the wrong way of putting it, but you know what I mean. It's sort of it pushes the game into a place that makes the game much easier, but it's the players that benefit from that making the game easier are ones actually that probably need it least. Like the ones that are so hardcore that are going to find everything are probably the players that are going to be more skillful at the game than the more casual ones who are not going to find that stuff.
Yeah. And it does, yes, I think that's true. And it makes you work for them, but in a positive way. There's gameplay attached to finding each one of those crystal shards. It's not just blow open this wall and you found one, or dig up this thing, what am I referring to here? And you found one. They're not 10 a penny. It is very much a finite resource, and you are effectively cheating death by going to find them, but you are being rewarded in that you're playing more of the game, and you have to work for them. It's not an easy thing. It reminded me a little bit of like the shrines in Ghost of Tsushima, where there is an actual puzzle or section of gameplay that revolves around just achieving this one end goal of getting a little bit of an extra resource, or part of a resource in this instance, because you have to get 4 of them. It's not like you just get given it. So I think overall for me, yes, that first initial feeling that when I first beat that final boss was relief that I'd beaten that boss not in a positive, uplifting way, like that fist pumping, like, yes, kind of did it kind of way. And then just that now that's done, I am going to go back in and kind of just potter about is what it is. That's almost what it feels like, just kind of pottering about in the world and enjoy that kind of exploration element now that I've got the stuff. And I've as I say, there's still a bunch of stuff I haven't found. I haven't found all the weapons, load of achievements to unlock if I was that way inclined. So yeah, and it's very thoughtful. I think even looking at the achievements list, like the fact that it doesn't just throw achievements at you for, you don't even get achievements for beating each boss, and that's almost unheard of in modern video games. It's more specific than that. It's more, did you do this specific thing? Did you find this particular thing in the world? Did you, go down this path far enough to unlock this specific reward, and here's an achievement for it? Not just, oh, you completed level 1, have an achievement, etc.
Well, sort of as a sort of an opposite to that, I started playing, totally unrelated, but I started playing Spellforce 3 recently, or the sort of standalone DLC for Spellforce 3. I forget what it's called now. That gives you achievement for starting a new game. Like, you don't even do anything. You just press and now play, make a character and go. And it's like, here you go, boom. Like you get awesome. 10 gamer score, whatever it was.
Please stay in our game. Here, have an achievement. As a quick thing, and it's worth throwing this out there. It's a thing I'd be interested in exploring actually on a future episode, the notion of achievements, trophies, whatever you want to call them, and how they're implemented and what developers can do with them and say about their game in their implementation. And I think this is a very good sort of case study for that. Death's Door is a good case study for that. And then there are other ones, like you've mentioned, Spellforce. And I remember back in the day, Walking Dead did you could get a platinum trophy just by playing and completing the game. But I think there might be a podcast episode in that kind of discussion about how they're implemented and the games that do it well and what they tell you about the game and the people that made it when it's done well. So if anybody listening would like to hear that or thinks that they've got something to contribute to that, then do let us know, because it's a thing that I'd like a reason to explore.
Yeah, absolutely. Until that time, we're going to call it a day on this episode. I'm sure you've already played Death's Door if you've listened this far. If you haven't, then go and play it. Probably a lot of it's been spoiled for you by now, but it's still worth playing. The reason we're talking about this, so we played it on PC. It's currently on Xbox, but next week, by the time this, it's 23rd of November, the game comes out on PlayStation and Switch. So it definitely is worth playing. And even
Can I also just do a quick pimp of our book, because we spoke to Acid Nerve, our first book that we wrote independent by design, Art and Stories of Indie Game Creation, which is a catchy title. We spoke to Acid Nerve about Titan Souls and about the formation of their company, and this was a good 5-6 years ago now. And so that's kind of their origin story is contained within that book. That's worth checking out, particularly as coming up, we have Black Friday deals next week. But yeah, stay tuned on Twitter and all of that malarkey to find out what's going on there. But yeah, have a look at that, because there's a lot of other independent developers in there as well, and their own origin stories. So yeah, that's worth having a look at.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, you can find that at indiebydesign.net, and our Twitter is at indiebydesign. All of our social media is at indiebydesign. Otherwise, thank you for listening, and we will see you again next week.